Here's a question nobody really asks. We know that humans learned to farm, we know they grew grain, stored it, and built settlements around it. But what happened after that? What did having enough food, more than enough food, actually do to a group of people? Because here's the thing about surplus. It does not just fill your stomach, it changes your entire world. It changes how you relate to other people, how you organize your community, who gets to lead and who follows, what you build, what you value, and what you fight over. Surplus, in other words, is where society begins, and that is exactly what we are going to explore today. Not the farming itself, but what farming made possible. How a community organized around grain slowly, gradually across countless generations, became something we can recognize as the beginning of human civilization. Imagine your community has just had a remarkable harvest, not just enough food for the season, more than enough. There's grain left over after everyone has eaten. Real surplus. For the first time, you have more than you immediately need. What happens next is fascinating. The first thing that happens is people stop moving. When food is stored in one place and there is enough of it to last through the difficult seasons, there is no reason to follow the herds anymore. No reason to pack up and go looking for something better over the next hill. You stay, you build, you invest your energy into the place you're in rather than the place you might be going, and staying together for longer periods and larger numbers creates something completely new in human experience. It creates neighbors, strangers living alongside each other, not just passing through the same territory, but genuinely sharing a life, a space, and a food supply. Now think about what that actually requires when you live in a small family group that moves constantly. Your social rules are simple. You know everyone, you trust everyone, decisions happen naturally and informally. But when your community grows to include dozens, then hundreds of people, many of whom you did not grow up with, that natural, informal way of organizing life starts to break down. You need new ways of deciding things, new ways of distributing what you have, new agreements about who does what work and what they receive in return, new answers to questions that had never needed asking before. Who manages the stored grain? How much does each family receive? What happens when someone takes more than their share? What do you do when two families disagree about something important? These are not farming problems. They are social problems, and the fact that agriculture created them, forced them into existence by bringing large groups of people together and giving them something valuable to share and protect is one of the most important things to understand about how human society actually began. Here's something worth thinking about. Farming at any real scale is genuinely impossible to do alone. It is not just physically demanding, though it absolutely is. It is the sheer scope of what needs to happen within tight, unforgiving time windows. The ground has to be cleared and prepared before planting season. Planting has to happen at exactly the right moment. The crop has to be managed and protected through months of growth. And then the harvest. Everything ripening at once, all of it, needing to be cut, gathered, threshed, and stored before it spoils or the weather destroys it. One person cannot do this for a community. 10 people cannot do it well. To farm enough food for a large settlement, you need organized, coordinated, collective effort. And that is a different kind of human cooperation than anything that had existed before. Hunter-gatherer groups cooperated too, of course, but their cooperation was flexible and fluid, everyone doing roughly similar things, adapting constantly to what the environment demanded that day. Agricultural cooperation is different. It requires planning in advance, dividing responsibilities deliberately, trusting that the person doing their part of the work will actually do it, even when you cannot see them, even when it is not your immediate concern. And this kind of organized, planned, divided labor naturally produces something else. It produces the need for someone to hold the whole picture in their head, someone who is thinking not just about their own row of crops, but about the entire community's harvest, about timing, about division of work, about what to do if something goes wrong. This is how leadership emerges, not through force, not at the beginning, through necessity and through trust. The person who understood the seasons better than anyone else, who knew which fields would produce the best yields, whose judgment had been proven right enough times that others naturally deferred to it when decisions needed to be made. Think about what that person actually is. They are not a ruler. They are not a politician. They are someone whose knowledge is so reliable and so valuable to the community that the community chooses to follow their guidance. Knowledge, not physical strength, not inherited status, is the original basis of human leadership. That is a remarkably hopeful thing about how society began, and it is something worth remembering. Alongside the growth of communities and the development of collective labor, something else was happening. something that would eventually change the entire scale of what farming could achieve. Tools were evolving, and not just any tools. Tools designed specifically, deliberately, and precisely for agriculture. In the earliest days of farming, people used whatever they already had. The same blades that cut meat were used to harvest grain. The same sticks used to dig up roots were used to turn soil. It worked, but only up to a point. Because a tool designed for one purpose and adapted for another is always going to be less effective than a tool designed from scratch for exactly the job it needs to do. And so gradually, agricultural tools began to appear. The sickle, a curved blade with carefully shaped teeth designed specifically for the motion of cutting grain stalks cleanly and quickly. The stone hoe, built for turning and breaking soil in a way that made it ready for planting. The grinding stone, two heavy flat surfaces that could crush harvested grain into flour far more efficiently than any previous method. Each of these tools represents something important. Not just a practical solution, a shift in the way the human mind was approaching problems. Because to design a purpose-built tool, you have to first understand the problem deeply enough to imagine a better answer to it. You have to think ahead. You have to hold the entire process in your mind, from planting to harvest to storage, and ask at each step, what would make this easier? What shape, what material, what motion would solve this specific problem? That is design thinking. That is engineering. And it was happening 10,000 years ago in farming communities that had no universities, no written science, and no inherited tradition of toolmaking for agriculture, because agriculture itself was new. Then came the moment that changed everything. Someone looked at an ox, a large, powerful animal that had until then been hunted or kept for meat, and had a completely different idea. What if that strength could be harnessed? What if instead of a person dragging a plow through the earth, an animal could do it? The ox-drawn plow multiplied what one person could farm by an enormous factor. Land that had been too hard, too heavy, too clay-thick to work by hand suddenly became farmable. Communities that had been limited by the physical capacity of their people were now limited only by how much land they had access to. More land farmed, more food produced, larger communities sustained, more people freed from farming to do other things, to make pots, build structures, craft more tools. The tool fed the community, and the community used its freedom to build more tools. This is the compounding logic of agricultural civilization. Each improvement makes the next improvement possible. Now, here's the part of this story that I think is the most important to understand, honestly, because this is where things get complicated. Surplus creates inequality, and it does this almost automatically, not because anyone plans it or intends it, but because of the simple logic of having more than you need. When everyone in a community produces exactly what they consume, there's no real gap between people. Nobody can accumulate significantly more than anyone else, because there's nothing left over to accumulate. You eat what you grow, and you grow what you eat. Simple equals sustainable. But the moment consistent surplus exists, that changes. Some families produce more than others. Some people are better farmers, have better land, or have more hands to work with. Some communities are in locations that give them natural advantages: better soil, more reliable water, more growing days in a year, and the ones who produce more can keep more, trade more, offer more, and in doing so they begin to accumulate not just grain, but influence. Grain, specifically, turns out to be perfectly suited to becoming the world's first currency. Unlike a freshly killed animal, it does not rot quickly. Unlike wild fruit, it stores for years when kept properly. It is measurable. You can count it, weigh it, divide it precisely. It is universally needed. Everyone eats, and it is portable enough to be moved and exchanged. So grain becomes a commodity, something that can be traded for other things, for tools, for labor, for protection, for loyalty. And this changes the entire social dynamic of the community, because now there are people who have a lot of grain and people who have very little. And having a lot of grain means having something that other people need, and having something that other people need is, in the oldest and most basic sense, what power actually is. This is not a criticism of the people involved. They were not being greedy or malicious. They were responding rationally to the situation agriculture had created. But the consequence was real and lasting. The social hierarchies that emerged in early farming communities, the gap between those who managed resources and those who worked for them, would shape human societies for thousands of years to come. And here's the thing worth sitting with: we have never fully resolved this tension. The question of how to share what the earth produces fairly, how to prevent the concentration of agricultural wealth from becoming the concentration of all power. That question is as alive today as it was in the first farming settlements 10,000 years ago. let us look at the granary one more time, because I think when you really see it for what it is, not just a building, but an idea, it changes how you understand everything that came after it. A granary manages shared resources. It has a system for deciding who contributes and who receives. It keeps records. It has someone in authority over it. It plans for the future, not just for today or tomorrow, but for the whole season ahead. It is, in other words, an institution, the first institution human beings ever created. And once you see it that way, something remarkable becomes clear. Every institution that has ever existed since, every bank, every government, every treasury, every cooperative, every organization of any kind is doing exactly the same thing. Managing shared resources, deciding distribution, maintaining records, planning ahead, concentrating authority over the system in someone's hands. The granary was the prototype, everything else was a variation on the same fundamental design. Think about this. The first taxes in human history were not paid in money. They were paid in grain. The first written records ever discovered those early scratches in clay from ancient Mesopotamia were not stories or prayers or poetry. They were grain accounts. Who had deposited how much was left in reserve. Writing itself, the technology that allowed humans to record knowledge, preserve history, develop science, and eventually create everything we call literature and philosophy, writing was invented to manage a granary, to keep track of grain. Let that sit for a moment. The entire written tradition of humanity began because someone needed to remember how much grain was in a pot. That is how directly, how completely, how absolutely agriculture is woven into the foundations of everything we consider civilization. Here's what I want you to carry with you from this episode. Everything we have talked about today, the surplus, the settlements, the collective labor, the tools, the trade, the granary, the first institutions, none of it was planned, none of it was designed by anyone who understood where it was all heading. These were ordinary people solving immediate problems, trying to eat, trying to organize fairly, trying to make life a little easier for the people around them, and yet look at what they built without intending to, without knowing it, without any blueprint or theory of society. They built the foundational structures that every human civilization since has inherited and built upon. That is the power of agriculture, not just as a way of producing food, but as a way of producing the conditions that force human beings to cooperate, to organize, to think beyond themselves and their immediate moment. Farming made us social. It made us planners. It made us builders of things that outlast any individual life. And here's why all of this matters right now, not just as history, but as something urgent and alive, the relationship between humans and the earth that made all of this possible. The careful listening, the patient observation, the working with natural systems rather than against them, that relationship began to break down. Slowly at first, then faster, then dramatically. And the consequences of that breakdown are exactly what we are living with today. In our next episode, we follow this story forward into the age of empires and iron, plows, into the Industrial Revolution and the chemical farming that followed it, into the moment when we stopped listening to the earth and started trying to control it completely, and into what that cost and what it is going to take to find our way back. Because the most important question Cultivated exists to ask is not where we came from, it is where we go next. And you cannot answer that honestly without understanding the full arc of how we got here. The roots go deep, the growth continues, and the conversation with the earth, the oldest conversation our species has ever had, is not finished yet.